Hello, my dear friends. How are you? I'm Mari Thurger, and today I'm going to talk about the mother goddess figure, or the earth mother goddess figure, in Germanic and Nordic pre-Christian contexts. I'll try to summarize this subject as best as I can, because, well, as you might imagine, there's plenty we can say and, of course, develop around the mother goddess figure. But today I want to solely focus on the Old Norse and Old Germanic and pre-Christian Scandinavian contexts. Perhaps later on a future video, I shall develop about the evolution of the Great Mother Goddess, or the Great Goddess figure in relation to neo-paganism, romantic conceptions, as well as feminist movements. But today it will solely be about Germanic peoples of the Iron Age and the development of the mother goddess figure into the medieval period. Now, just before we start, I would like to dedicate this video to Vanatru Italia, which is the heathen section of the Italian polytheistic association Il Bosco di Chiatri. I know I have a couple of Italian subscribers in this channel and also Italian patrons, my dear patrons. So you might be interested in exploring this religious, cultural, and apolitical Italian heathen movement focused on different contexts concerning the spiritual, the religious, and the philosophical approach to the Vanir deities. Not solely limited to the Germanic gods, of course, obviously, but also dedicated to the worship of the North European pagan pantheon in all its forms, including the Baltic and Sami pre-Christian traditional practices, and by extension, any branch which has its roots in pre-Indo-European Old Europe. So, if you are interested, I'll leave information about Vanatru Italia down below in the description of this video, as well as the links to them. You might find this particular movement interesting because it's also strictly connected to the European witchcraft expression of the Vanir cult, as well as an approach to necromancy and shamanism. And I hope I have perceived this right. All these spiritual, philosophical, and also religious approaches by Vanatru Italia, of course, are strictly linked to the secrets of nature and its great essence, in a necromantic sense found in nature and the deities and the supernatural entities representative of such telluric forces. Now, if you allow me, just a few words directly to them, so please bear it with me. Grazie mille Vanatru Italia per il supporto e l'amicizia, so che apprezzate quello che faccio e avete spesso contribuito alla diffusione del mio lavoro, quindi grazie davvero. Voglio anche ringraziarvi per il lavoro svolto. Al giorno, dove vi sono molte correnti religiose neopagane, ma un raro interesse nelle arti magiche, nell'occulto, nella stregoneria, soprattutto quando si tratta di certe scuole di magia rimaste nell'oscurità troppo a lungo che hanno guadagnato una pessima reputazione. Le persone dovranno essere molto più concentrate sulle idee nell'intento di sostituire la cristianità con qualcosa di simile che abbia un'etichetta più cool al posto di essere davvero interessati al paganismo, il quale si basa soprattutto sul segretismo di diverse credenze e su espressioni pratiche di fede come la cerimonia del culto e del rituale verso le entità sovrannaturali della terra. Quindi grazie per esservi soffermati su questo approccio molto apprezzato e necessario per immergerci nella realtà spirituale vivente. Right, there it is. I have probably absolutely murdered the language. My apologies, of course, but I did try my best. And also thank you to Ottavia Bonaventre, my dear friend and patron as well, for helping me with my very, very rusty Italian. Now, my dear friends, let's delve into today's subject, finally. Please. Well, the most common mythical imagery we have of the Mother Goddess is her representation as Mother Earth, appearing as the wife of the supreme sky god, demonstrating religious syncretism reflected in the theme of Earth embracing and becoming fruitful by the god of the heavens. Of course, this isn't a global reality, not even a reality strictly of Europe alone, as we have plenty of European goddesses who were sky deities, solar deities, wind goddesses, storm goddesses, moon goddesses, whose cults and religions did not demonstrate at all a male counterpart. So speaking of this specific point, and speaking of Scandinavians, we do have an interesting account concerning a mother goddess figure who isn't an earth goddess, but goddess of the night, without a male counterpart, and still she plays the role of creator. It is curious, if we analyze the prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, of course, he presents us with a description of the world and of the stars as having been created by the children of Bor, who took the sparks out of the land of fire, Muspel, and placed them in the sky, in the heavens. So the world is created by male gods, children of a cosmic male entity, but soon after, following this myth and without any explanation or interruption, Snorri conveys a completely alternative myth to what he initially describes about the origins of all things through the death of Hymir and the usage of cosmic bodies. He presents us with a second myth about Nut, night, which is characterized as dark and black, which gives birth to prosperity, Old, to earth, Jord, and the day, Dogr. And while she crosses the sky with the horse Frostmane, Hrimfaxi, her third children makes the same trip with the horse Brightmane, Skinfaxi. In other words, Snorri presents two different myths about creation. One involving the death and dismemberment of the cosmic entity, hermaphroditic entity Ymir, that reflects parallels with myths from a Proto-Indo-European past, and then a myth in which the night is a goddess of creation and gives birth to the world itself and everything that is needed for it to prosper, giving birth to prosperity itself, and also giving birth to the earth and to the day. The night represented as a mother goddess who is the progenitor of the earth and the sun, giving us a much older alternative myth from prehistoric animistic past. That is why this myth about the creation of the world is curious, not being made by Odin, the god Odin, and his brothers, but by the night, which appears as a kind of cosmic matriarch. This is interesting because, once again, it helps us to understand the Scandinavian pre-Christian religious reality. Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, in plain Catholic period in Iceland, had several poetic sources in front of him, both surviving oral traditions and also written sources, each pointing to something completely different. And Snorri, it is he who tries to consolidate all of this in an attempt to create a unique narrative, which originally wasn't so. And it actually points to a religious panorama of pre-Christian Scandinavia that did not reflect at all in any way a single religious understanding shared by all, but rather a cultural syncretism from different eras and peoples embracing different narratives. This myth of the night goddess is curious, being the cosmic matriarch who created everything, because not only it reflects a prehistoric past, long before Germanic influences, but also before the Indo-European religious and mythological influences. So, in terms of Scandinavia, This is perhaps the oldest mother goddess figure we are able to find. This is how far we can go. A cosmic matriarch, goddess of the night. In other words, in terms of mother goddess figures in pre-Christian Scandinavia, this is the oldest we can reach, or the earliest in terms of time. Of course, we still have well present the image of the Earth Mother, from whom we originate, it nourishes us, and to which we eventually return to at the end of our cycle. Perhaps the best source we have concerning Germanic peoples and this idea of an earth goddess comes from Tacitus in his work Germania. Even though Tacitus' Germania is more of political criticism towards Rome than an actual historical analysis, as he is clearly using examples among the Germanic peoples to demonstrate the lack of virtues within the Roman Empire, especially within the core of the empire. Most of what Tacitus speaks about within the work Germania not only is a political criticism, but also a portrayal of Germanic peoples based on hearsay and the tales of travelers, merchants, and soldiers, as well as, and this is important to underline, Tacitus expresses certain virtues, traits, and characteristics of the Germanic peoples, various Germanic tribes, in an attempt to show what he wished Romans would be like. A great portion of Tacitus' work isn't how Germanic peoples were actually like, but Tacitus portrays them in specific ways to express his criticism towards Rome that should adopt these virtues Tacitus himself thinks are right. Which is why Tacitus tells us that the goddess Nerthus, worshipped in what is nowadays Denmark, as you know it, was the Germanic Telos Mater, Mother Earth. So this constitutes a problem because we don't actually know if indeed these Germanic peoples, these Germanic tribes, were really worshipping Nerthus as a Mother Earth goddess, or if it is in fact Tacitus transporting his idea of Telos Mater, the Mother Earth, into the Germanic goddess Nerthus. This is more complicated than what it seems, because we take it for granted, the worship of a Mother Earth goddess figure among the Iron Age Germanic peoples of continental Europe, which, of course, honestly, it wouldn't be surprising because as the myths of male sky gods progressively take hold in Europe, indeed, it would not be that strange that all of a sudden we have a Earth Mother goddess, wife of the male sky god. We can almost simplify this a lot as the Neolithic matriarchal cultures being eventually subjugated by the surging of Eastern patriarchal cultures, in which the chieftain of the tribe was the military, the political and religious leader, and there's cultural syncretism. However, we do have to take into consideration the great amount of prehistoric goddesses of the sky as well, and cultural syncretism does not utterly banish earlier religious conceptions. So Germanic peoples by the Iron Age, within some cultural pockets, would still believe in sky mother goddesses, such as the example of pre-Christian Scandinavians I've given before. Of all the cultural influences they have had, their prehistoric cosmic matriarch still survived it all and was probably still worshipped among many other deities. So, was the Germanic Nerthus really a Mother Earth figure, or simply Tacitus portraying her as the mother figure based on comparing her cult to the cult of the Mother Earth goddess within the Roman Empire itself? So, it's clear that Nerthus is related to fertility and wealth, because her cult is also very similar to the same ritualistic and ceremonial processions in the Scandinavian cult of Frigg and Freya. But being a fertility goddess doesn't have to necessarily put her in the category of Mother Earth goddess, obviously. The likely scenario here is that Nerthus was one of the goddesses representative of fertility, wealth, peace, and plenty, which gets closer to the Scandinavian characterizations of the Vanir gods, which are also gods of fertility, peace, and plenty. Nerthus is described as the earth, the Mother Earth, by Tacitus, but she could very well have been a very important goddess, obviously, but not strictly worshipped as the Mother Earth goddess by the Northern Germanic pagans, but worshipped as the goddess of peace and plenty related to the elite, a goddess of the elite of nobility. Perhaps this gets a little bit clearer if we explore Scandinavian contexts. Indeed, it's actually extremely hard to find any clear proof of the actual worship of the Earth Mother in heathen Scandinavian, in pre-Christian Scandinavia. For instance, the mother of Thor, the god Thor, is Fjorgyn, which to us is nothing more than just a name, as there is no other actual practical or physical evidences of her worship, as the name was only used by poets as a synonym for earth. I have no doubt that Thor has been considered the son of the earth, as Thor is frequently said to be the son of Jordr, which is the earth. And we can find this in several sources, such as Oslong, Hrimskvida, Lokasena, Gylfaginning, and Skaldskaparmal, so on and so forth. Jordr is the daughter of Nut, the goddess of the night, previously spoken, the cosmic matriarch. Therefore, whatever earthly phenomenon will be the production of the earth itself. And since Thor is thunder, it is weather phenomenon of the earth, so it makes sense Thor being the son of the earth. But that's the thing. We have several names that were used as synonyms for earth, such as Jord, Fjorgyn, Jording, Fold, and Grunde. All of these mean earth, which seem to be merely poetic synonyms for the mother of Thor, created by the skalds, by the poets. This doesn't mean that these are all different earth goddesses, or that these are several names for the same earth mother goddess. It just means it is a poetic work in reference to the mother of Thor, which is the earth. The Mother Earth goddess doesn't have to necessarily have a name to be worshipped, or be worshipped at all, but simply as an animistic conception, acknowledging the earth as a living entity rather than a goddess. To prehistoric Scandinavians, it would seem that the actual matriarchal goddess was the night, from whom earth was created, and earth would not have been worshipped as a goddess, but rather as a living entity, which in turn is the progenitor of all life that resides in it. So there's a big difference here between perceptions of a Mother Earth goddess and the animistic living entity of the earth. Just because some cultures give names to their mother goddesses and worship mother goddesses doesn't have to necessarily be the exact same thing or the exact same religious parallel in every other culture, right? So in this way, Nerthus would likely be a goddess of peace and plenty and not the Mother Earth goddess perceived by Tacitus. And in Scandinavian contexts, Jordr, the earth, or Fjorgyn and all the other names, doesn't mean that this is a case of a Mother Earth goddess, but rather poetic synonyms in reference to the earth, not as a goddess, but remoting to an animistic understanding of the earth as a non-human person. That's the important animistic perspective we have to take in mind, and we have to really consider, because a deity, a goddess or a god, is characterized as a supernatural entity, provider of something, according to the reality that supernatural entity controls. And therefore, there is worship, veneration to that deity in order to receive or to please and avoid receiving what that deity controls. But animism deals with a much broader panorama, and it isn't solely about supernatural entities, solely about gods and goddesses. It's also about non-human people. The basic perception within animism is that it deals with the belief that the world is absolutely populated with persons, and only a tiny fraction are human persons. That is quite different from a supernatural entity, a god or a goddess. For instance, a bear is seen as a non-human person. It is the bear person. Likewise, any other animal is a non-human person. Can be a bird person, fish person, rock person, tree person. These are not supernatural entities. These are living persons with whom the human person can interact with. The same thing goes to phenomenon of the earth, such as thunder. Thunder is the non-human person of thunder, which manifests itself in the sky, which is its habitat, belonging to the earth, which is the non-human living person, the earth mother, not as a goddess, not as a supernatural entity, but as a living entity, acknowledged as being alive and bearing children and nurturing its children. In the figure of the god Thor, we still see this animistic past before Thor was eventually deified. Thor is literally the personification of thunder. In many indigenous religions, especially circumpolar ones, thunder is always seen as a non-human person. What I mean by this is that it is not merely a phenomenon of nature, or a personification, or a spirit, or a power of a deity, but a non-human person. In the animistic understanding, the world is populated by people, as I've said, but not all are human. In fact, the vast majority are not human at all. This means that animals are seen as people, as well as trees and everything that manifests presence, action, and consequence. I think that a good example of what I'm explaining will be the case of stones, which we have generally romanticized and constructed this modern idea that in animism everything is believed to be alive, but it isn't so. Only that which shows some action and shows signs of spirit, consciousness, and causes effect is actually alive. Not all stones are alive, but some are. That is why the thunder in many animistic religions is seen as a non-human person, a being that manifests itself, causes effect. Thor, therefore, would even be seen as a non-human person, which is thunder, the being that causes something, that manifests itself. And that is why generally every time the thunder hit the earth, and for some reason a stone would appear from the ground in that place, the stone was considered sacred and was regarded as a person, because it was the manifestation of the thunder person. Of course, eventually the god Thor takes on another form and is finally anthropomorphized. And we see this a lot in Native American animism, actually. For example, a stone may have been alive for a time, but then it is gone, no longer has spirit and consciousness, and no longer causes effect. For several generations, a specific stone is treated or regarded as a person in the native language, until at a certain point in the indigenous languages, they stop treating it as a person and start treating it as a thing. It changes in the language. And then we know that for those people, that stone is no longer alive. It no longer has spirit and consciousness and no longer causes effect. This is why in animism we have to make a special effort to understand Thor's case. Thor would not be merely a spirit. In fact, the conception of spirit in animism does not really exist as we know today, because the concept of spirit is Roman Christian, as being something dead that exists in spiritual form. In animism, this is not really so. When something is alive, it does not necessarily have to be inhabited by a dead spirit. The thing is alive, so it is a person, so it's not dead yet. Thor would then be a non-human person, a being that is alive in animism. Mind that, of course, a spirit can inhabit something. An idol or a fetish can be created to trap and hold a spirit, or even the thunder person can be invited to inhabit an idol made to resemble that thunder person, to, of course, bring benefit into the community, physical benefit, whenever it is called upon, of course. And this already formulates a type of worship that leads eventually to the deification of the entity. But it's still a non-human person, it is still alive. So thunder in animistic perception is the non-human person child of the non-human person earth, which gives us the idea that many other earth phenomenon are non-human persons, non-human people, children of the earth. So we start to have an important construction here in terms of gods and goddesses, because eventually, originally, these were phenomena of the earth, which eventually ended up being deified, and names given to them and being worshipped. So in this way, Nerthus would not have been the Mother Earth, but a deified phenomenon that propitiates fertility, peace, and plenty, daughter of the earth. Remember the Scandinavian myth of creation spoken before. The night is the great mother goddess creator, not only of the earth and the day, but also a third child, which is prosperity itself. But let's explore more of that, please. Continuing to speak about Nerthus, her cult was said to be on an island where she had a specific sanctuary dedicated to her cult. We have to remember that Nerthus wasn't a general goddess of the continental Old Germanic peoples. Even Tacitus was quite specific on that one, that she was a goddess worshipped by a couple of tribes from where it is nowadays Denmark, as you know it, and as I've said before. A possible place of worship would be Zealand, in Denmark, precisely in the island where Copenhagen is located. Zealand was indeed associated with a goddess during the Viking period. A couple of centuries later, Snorri Sturluson himself tells us how Zealand was formed by a goddess he names Gefion, whose sanctuary stood in Leir, precisely on the island of Zealand in East Denmark. Snorri tells us that Gefion plowed round the island and separated it from Sweden. Now, I don't believe this goddess Gefion was the same as Nerthus, because she was specifically worshipped in Leir, which was the seat of the Danish kings in earlier periods. So Gefion seems to be a goddess associated with the plow and agriculture, a goddess who married Skjold or Scyld, which is one of the traditional god kings who came across the sea, bringing peace and prosperity to Denmark. Pay close attention to that. So, as you can see, she bears close resemblances with the goddess Freya of the Swedes. So Gefion would have been a goddess of peace and plenty and associated with nobility, just like Freya, and not the same as Nerthus. In fact, in the 12th century, there was a place name called Njartharum, which is nowadays Nirum, not far from Copenhagen to the north, closer to the shore. So this might have been the actual sanctuary to the goddess Nerthus, based on the place name and its proximity to the sea, to the ocean. While Gefion would be the goddess associated with nobility, agriculture, the plow, and peace and plenty. But both Nerthus and Gefion, one way or another, are associated with the sea, with the ocean, with waters, and the peace and prosperity that comes from the sea. Let's not forget that Nerthus bears close resemblances with the Germanic god Mjollnir, a god of the sea and of peace and plenty and wealth. And not surprisingly, his children are Frigg and Freya, the lord and the lady, likewise associated with peace and plenty and nobility and wealth. So it's pretty interesting, these deities being connected to the sea and the prosperity, peace and plenty that comes from it. And they all fall into the group of the so-called Vanir gods, which are precisely the gods of peace and plenty. We must take into consideration that the Vanir gods seem to have indeed originated among the seafaring folk of the Baltic and the southern shores of the North Sea, and to have spread thence into Denmark, Sweden and Norway eventually. I'm not going to develop much on this influence from the Baltic because these are pretty recent studies which need more time to mature. As you know, Baltic countries such as Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia are quite recent countries concerning their independence. Finally on their own, as they have managed to get themselves rid of the Soviet Union. So studies on the traditions and the historical past of these countries, especially, of course, on the pre-Christian historical past, have been quite recent, since these countries are now able to really have considerable freedom in their own new systems of governance. But we have already plenty of archaeological evidences that the Vikings were not only people from Scandinavia. There were a lot of Vikings from Finland, as well as from the Baltic and other countries, actually. As you well know, a Viking is not a specific type of a person or a people, but a profession, a way of life, an activity, piracy, but also trading and exploration, of course. Seafaring, mainly. So it's not at all inconceivable, this idea of peace and plenty and wealth from the sea, on the part of a variety of deities that fit into the group of the Vanir gods. Gods which indeed seem to have originated among the seafaring folk of the Baltic and brought to Scandinavia. And it's important to take special notice at the peace aspects related to these deities coming from the sea, from the ocean. As you well know, in the Norse myths, there is this recurring myth of the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, these two tribes of gods, especially conflicts between the god Odin and the Vanir. Remember that the third largest city in Denmark is Odense, the main city of the island of Fyn. The name Odense is derived from the god Odin, meaning Odin's sanctuary, as the area was known as a sanctuary for worshippers of the Norse god Odin. So this reflects the clash of cultures coming from the sea into mainland Denmark, the Vanir and the Aesir. The island that stays in between is precisely Zealand, which would have been disputed territory at some point between the raiding Vikings of the Baltic and their sea gods, the Vanir, against the Danish war god Odin. And so in the island of Zealand, we have this fusion of cultures and gods, the peace that was eventually achieved between the Aesir and the Vanir, or in other words, between the people of Denmark and the seafaring people of the Baltic. So it's quite possible that the Vanir are indeed gods from the Baltic, eventually incorporated into nobility through alliances and marriage. Hence the reason we have the Vanir usually associated with nobility. And as I have said, the goddess Gefion, associated with agriculture, the plough, fertility, peace and plenty, and goddess of the nobility of the Danish kings of Leir, married Skjold, the god king that came from across the sea, bringing precisely peace and prosperity to Denmark. Gefion bears close resemblances with Freya, and indeed one of Freya's names was Gefn. And as you can see, the names Gefion and Gefn bear a significant likeness, not only between themselves, but also with some of the mother figures in the Roman period, the matrons and the matron cult. It's also curious that both Gefion and Freya had a necklace, said to have been given to them in exchange for their favors, which of course seems to denote payment or offering for their powers rather than for sexual favor, as it is pointed out in much later sources. As was said before, it's really hard to find proof of an actual worship to the Earth Mother Goddess or an Earth Mother Goddess in Scandinavia. The only maternal figure surviving in the accounts is actually Frigg, the wife of Odin and the mother of Balder. Although Frigg is not originally a goddess from Scandinavia, but brought into Scandinavia during the migration period, and in Scandinavia her name was changed into Frigg, originally having been the earlier continental Germanic goddess Freya or Freya, and the double I changing into double G in Scandinavia. This is the goddess that gave origins to the name of the week, Friday. It's not Freya's day, it's Frigg's day. Still, her function seems to be quite clear. Essentially, the revered wife and mother, consort of the high god. Although, this is curious because the high god would have been Thewas for the continental Germanic peoples, which in Scandinavia was known as Tweed. But due to the religious changes and with the introduction of the cult of Odin in Scandinavia, Tweed completely fell into a very shadowy level, as the cult of Odin and Thor as well progressively gained importance and a lot more religious ground in Scandinavia. It's interesting because the early Germanic goddess Freya was the wife of Woden or Golden, and this forms the typical myth or the typical theme of the Mother Earth goddess appearing as the wife of the supreme sky god. Which in here, Woden or Golden, isn't necessarily the main Germanic god of the sky, but a god of the weather. Of course, technically a phenomenon of the sky, but not playing the general Germanic figure of sky daddy. Freya and Woden are the pairing figures from lower Germanic peoples, and their importance as gods of specific Germanic tribes of southern continental Germanic territories progressively grew, and such cults were eventually brought into Scandinavia and gained other proportions. So this is a good example of what I told you previously. Not everybody was worshipping the exact same thing, and there wasn't a unique religious thought to which everyone subscribed to, but several different religious and mythological conceptions and ideas which eventually spread, and some survived and others did not, and others were mixed together, merged together. So Freya and Woden survived, and when brought into Scandinavia they became Frigg and Odin. And this pair is actually the only survivable representation of a possible mother goddess, wife of a god of the sky. Originally a weather god not as in telling you if it's going to rain tomorrow or not, and in which direction the wind will blow, so take care when you go out this week, but the god of the wind and thunder as well, to specific lower Germanic tribes, as I said, which eventually became Odin in Scandinavia. And due to the popularity of his cult among nobility, Odin was highly praised by poets, by skalds within the Scandinavian court, to please their wealthy patrons. And as such, we have a lot more sources concerning Odin, obviously, because he was being praised by those who could read and write and had the power of the word, and the written word as well, and made most of the poetic works. But Frigg is indeed the only surviving sort of Earth Mother goddess, which in Scandinavia was no longer connected to the Earth at all, but she had been more or less when she was still Freya in continental Germanic territories. In the poetic poem Old Germanic, the goddess Frigg is named together with Freya as a goddess to be invoked by women in labor. Even though these are two distinct goddesses, in Scandinavia each incorporated the attributes of the other. Cultural exchanges in an attempt to make a sort of union of ideas, not just in religious terms, but mostly actually to facilitate the spreading of ideas through poetry. Still, without a doubt, Frigg is associated with motherhood and the protection of children as well as childbirth. An idea not only reflected in this poem, but also within the opening chapter of the Volsunga saga, where she appears concerned with the birth of children. And as said before, the day of the week of the goddess Frigg is Friday, a day that was long considered, at least in Germany, until quite recently actually, considered to be a lucky day for marriages and to constitute a family. So we see in Frigg, more than any other goddess of the old Germanic and Nordic peoples actually, this connection to family, motherhood and children. So Frigg by far is indeed the goddess we can point, the Germanic and Nordic goddess of course, we can point to be the mother goddess figure for the pagan Germanic peoples of the past. So in conclusion, and I also hope you have paid close attention to the notes in this video, and please do check this information icon in this right upper corner and check the videos I have recommended in there in relation to this one, as well as the description of the video. But in conclusion, it would seem that Nerthus would not be particularly the Mother Earth figure she has been usually associated with, at least among scholars of the past century, due to what Tacitus said, but rather a goddess of fertility and plenty, a sea goddess, most likely, and originally from the Baltic, just like Gefion, whose name appears in Old English as Gefion, used in poetry as a name for the sea, and Gefion herself bears close resemblances to Freya. These goddesses enter in the group of the Vanir gods, gods of peace and plenty and gods of the sea, of the ocean and wealth and related to nobility. And I understand why many people associate these goddesses to the earth and to the Earth Mother figure, and even possibly as surviving goddesses originating in the Neolithic, precisely due to the idea of the early farming communities and their connection to the earth and fertility as powers of nature greatly praised to ensure survival. But we must remember that geography plays an important role in the conceptions of these mythologies, as well as the climate. Earth Mother goddesses are usually more common in Southern Europe, where the Neolithic period was in fact an extensive and very important period, which had a considerable influence upon the religious minds of these peoples. So we find, of course, plenty of earth goddesses and mother goddesses in Southern Europe. Mother goddesses and the solar goddesses related to fertility and the soils and the earth. This doesn't mean that there wasn't a Neolithic period in Scandinavia, of course. There was, short, but it existed. But saying that Iron Age and early medieval goddesses such as Freya, Gefion and Nerthus are Neolithic goddesses is a mistake, because we do not have any evidences at all of their existence before the Iron Age, before the migration period. And these are goddesses related to nobility as well, because religion was held by the elite. The elite controlled the economy. politics and religion, and the great yearly celebrations were performed by the nobility. And these goddesses and their place names appear in places where the ruling elites had a considerable power. Great urban centers and great political and trading centers and military centers as well. And let's not forget the connection these deities have to the sea, to the ocean, either by marrying gods of the sea or sanctuaries close to the coast, or being related to the sea gods. And the sea being a constant provider of wealth, peace, plenty, fertility, and power in the continental Germanic and Old Norse myths. Because indeed, due to the geographical and climate characteristics of these regions in the north, the sea, the ocean, has always been the main alternative for survival for Scandinavians, since the Bronze Age actually, and much earlier than that. In fact, in Norway, we find a lot more cultural influences from the Atlantic rather than from Germanic and other Scandinavian influences. We clearly see Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and up until the Bronze Age in Norway, Southern Atlantic cultural influences, including religious motifs from Southern Europe, where it is nowadays Portugal, actually. The Southern Atlantic and a continuous cultural influence along the coast, reaching Norway. So the sea has always been a great realm of communication between these peoples and an alternative for survival and a means to obtain wealth, prosperity, and plenty. But more on that on another video in the future. So, in the case of Nerthus and her aspect as Earth Mother Goddess, that seems to have been Tacitus' idea, equating her with Tellus Mater, the Mother Earth, equating Nerthus with what he was familiar with. But she seems to have been mainly a sea goddess and related to fertility and peace and plenty, characteristics that fit perfectly into the main powers and gifts of the Vanir gods, the so-called Vanir gods. On the other hand, we have Freya assimilating certain aspects of the Germanic goddess Frigg when the latter was brought into Scandinavia during the migration period, but Freya enters in the same panorama as Nerthus and Gefion. And Gefion being of Denmark, we see some parallels with the Roman mother figures, which isn't that surprising, as there was plenty of Roman influences in continental Germania upon cultures of the continental Germanic peoples, such as name giving to the days of the week, artifacts such as bracteates, writing systems, and so on and so forth. So, of course, there are parallels. But, as said before, indeed, any clear proof of the worship of the Earth Mother or Earth Mother Goddess in pre-Christian Scandinavia is hard to find, very hard indeed. Even in the case of the giantess Jordr, mother of Thor, which is closer to an animistic understanding of the living entity of the Earth itself, rather than an actual goddess, a supernatural entity worshipped as the Mother Earth figure. The only Germanic/Scandinavian goddess we can truly say she has some considerably strong parallels with a Mother Earth figure or just a mother figure would be Frigg. And even so, it's not specifically related to the Earth actually, no longer in the Iron Age, and the fertility of the soils, but related to motherhood, childbirth, and marriage. Related to the family, so not specifically the earth, but surely to motherhood. Although there are no evidences of her worship in Scandinavia, as she mainly plays a poetic role, as she is found in many literary works. She plays a consistent part in poetry, but poetry doesn't mean mythology, of course, because there is also lack of detail about her in the myths themselves, and a failure to find place names after her. Unlike Freya, Frigg in the north remains a very shadowy figure, which is understandable because Freya had a considerable amount of worshipping and held great power in Scandinavia before the introduction of Frigg in the north. And as such, Frigg was completely overshadowed in the mythological narratives by Freya. So even though the Earth Mother goddess figure in continental Germanic territories and in pre-Christian Scandinavia isn't that well defined, the goddesses Freya, Gefion and Nerthus are still very powerful goddesses, obviously, associated with fertility, peace, plenty and wealth. While Frigg, on the other hand, is the one with the qualities, perceivable qualities of the mother figure, a goddess from lower continental Germanic territories, progressively making her way due north, eventually overshadowed by Freya in Scandinavia. But at least she seems to have had considerable importance in continental Europe among certain Germanic tribes below the Rhine and the Danube during the Iron Age, but not as Frigg, but as Freya, as was said before. Nut. I almost forgot. At the very beginning of this video, I spoke about the cosmic matriarch, the goddess of the night. Now, that seems to be the oldest or earliest Scandinavian mother goddess figure, but again, not an earth goddess, but the goddess of the night, the cosmic matriarch that created prosperity and the day and the earth itself. Therefore, all life comes from this prehistoric cosmic matriarch. All right, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video and that it was useful somehow. You have probably noticed this on my left eye and you are probably wondering, what the hell is that? Well, I can honestly say that I'm way better now. A week ago, this was pretty bad. A lot of pressure. This eye wasn't that good to begin with, and now with this pressure in here, half of it is in complete shadow and the other half is shrouded in mist. Anyway, if you think this is bad, well, you should see the other guy. Just kidding. I actually woke up like this one night. I don't know what happened. It's probably a severe case of ghosts. This was actually recorded in October, so, well, there are certain things in the air, and we have to take the opportunity to communicate with such things. So that's what happens when you meddle in things you should not be meddling in. So shit happens. Anyway, it doesn't matter, really. The gods gave me 2 eyes, so I can spare 1. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för det.